Knowing the hour and the presence of a quorum, I'll call the March 24th meeting of the Acton Finance Committee to order. And with that, the first item on the agenda is public participation. And since the only member of the public is Franny Osmond, and the first item on the agenda is Transportation Enterprise Fund, I'll assume that's why you're here, Franny.
Actually, I want to hear about everything.
Okay.
Just in preparation for town meeting, but I'm able to answer any questions you have, if you do have them, on transportation.
All right, then we'll move on to that. Margaret, I think you've been in deep discussions with the powers that be on transportation, and if you wouldn't mind bring the rest of the committee up to date.
Yeah, sure. So, yes, so after our last meeting, Doug Halley and Brian and Steve Barrett and I chatted. They reached out to me, which I thought was great, and we chatted, got a little bit more detail. This presentation, this is the same one, right? We went through, and I found it helpful for me, especially some of the information about the surveys that had been done. And that there is, at least a sensibility among some in town that there is, that there is a desire for some kind of fixed route shuttle. However, I still am worried about the numbers. If you look at the article, the way it's proposed, you'll see that 509,000 for transportation purposes, 234 of that will be raised from the general revenues. 178,000 is raised from department receipts, and the 96,000 from the commuter lot parking fees. So if you flip over to slide, it doesn't have a number on it, but it's this one, it's transportation program. So it's sort of towards the back. I can't really tell you what it is. So if you flip it to that, you'll see that when they say the 178,000 to be raised from department receipts, most of that is from different grants, cherry sheet items that come to us. So that LRTA, the 39,000, you'll see that, the 61,000, the 60,000, that's all in the form of grants to us. And then the remaining part of that 178,000 is the 18,000 from the fares that are raised. So just to point out that there's, out of the 500,000 or so that we're wanting to have, or that would be funding all of transportation, only 18,000 of that is from fares. And we all know that public transportation doesn't pay, and I think we've all become comfortable with that concept and are willing to support public transportation nonetheless. I guess what concerns me is how much are we willing to support public transportation? At what level are we willing to subsidize it? And I think that's a question that I've never really heard articulated or answered in some manner. And so what concerns me is adding yet another shuttle service when right now we're paying so much money for services that aren't used a tremendous amount. I was doing just kind of some back of the envelope calculations, and if you keep sort of looking at this slide, and you'll see that there's sort of the COA van, the dial-a-ride, the Roadrunner, the rail shuttle, and then this new proposal, the fixed route. first of all, is everyone clear what all those different things are? Because I now am clear on what they are, if you want to ask me. So, but if everyone's clear on it, that's great. But you'll see that, for instance, the dial-a-ride is actually not supported by any kind of grant. It comes directly from the town. And that, so it's really almost entirely supported just from general revenues. If you flip to the slide before that, you'll see that if you look at this bar chart, it seems impressive that we have had, you know, a sizable increase in our usership overall in our transportation services. However, if you sort of hone in on the dial-a-ride and the COA van and the Roadrunner, those numbers look like they've stayed roughly the same since 2012. And so if you look at the dial-a-ride, I couldn't tell exactly from this chart how many rides per day this represents, but I'm guessing based on the size of the block that it's a roughly 10 or 12 rides a day that the dial-a-ride provides on an averaged basis. And Doug told me that the shuttles operate 260 days per year. So if you just do a quick back of the envelope calculation and you say, okay, so we're giving, let's see my back of the envelope calculation. We are giving, oops, 2,600 rides per year, roughly, on the dial-a-ride, and we're spending $90,000 to do that. So that ends up coming out as being almost $35 that we're spending per ride. And to me, you know, if we're really looking to provide this kind of a service that we feel that we must provide a door-to-door service that the town is somehow obligated to do that, I think it's more worth it just to call up a cab company, honestly, and to be having them provide this, because it's very expensive for the town. What I talked with Doug and Brian and Steve about was, and I had sort of brought this up at the last time they were here presenting, is if we have this fixed route shuttle, you know, does the dial-a-ride go away? Because it seems like the dial-a-ride could easily cannibalize fixed route shuttle. Because if you're sort of saying to myself, do I take the fixed route or do I call up and get a ride door to door? You know, you might say, I might just get a door to door ride if it's convenient. So, and Doug actually did say that the idea would be to potentially phase that out over time if they felt like the fixed route shuttle was meeting needs and it was, and you know, fewer people were riding the dial-a-ride. But I guess what I would propose is that so I'll just end that portion of the piece of the dial-a-ride. Going back to the bigger picture, and what I've said before, and what I also said to Doug and Brian and Steve, is what I would like to see is for me personally to support the fixed route shuttle is some kind of benchmarks that we put in place, that the selectmen put in place, that says, okay, we want the ridership to be up to here, you know, by year 1, year 2, year 3, year 4, year 5, whatever it is, and to, you know, make our costs per ride go down to X or whatever that is, so that we're not just sort of willy-nilly saying, you know what, public transport's always going to cost us money, and we're fine to, you know, subsidize riders at $35 a pop. Because I think that's where we have, you know, in my view, we haven't been rigorous about what it means to subsidize public transportation. So with that in mind, I emailed Doug and the others and said that what I'm comfortable with for kind of my, I guess, guiding principles are, you know, I support the idea of public transportation in principle. And I also, again, understand that it almost nearly always operates at a deficit. But again, the amount of that deficit is something that we have to keep in mind and decide clearly how much deficit we as a town are willing to fund. You know, when we have all these other competing priorities, we want to invest in a senior center, we want to not eat up the reserves every year, we want to make sure the schools have funding, you know, to pay $35 a pot for somebody to go door to door. To me, it's just, I just can't think that's justified. And I know that the thought behind it was, you know, let's really get the ridership up, but it just hasn't seemed to have happened. And so hopefully the fixed route shuttle will actually be a better thing. And I think that the fixed route shuttle actually really is a more efficient way of organizing public transportation than this current sort of dial-a-ride system that we have. And I understand that the dial-a-ride was sort of a way to kind of just get movement going for public transportation in the town. So I definitely don't criticize the effort at all, because I think that the thought behind it was a very good one. So what I told Doug and the others is, you know, I'm willing to support the transportation article in its current form if we can do the following: lay out the clear benchmarks that would articulate the ridership goals over the next 5 years. And as part of those benchmarks, indicate clearly when we would phase out the dial-a-ride service. You know, I think that we could phase it out now, personally, but I won't force that. I mean, I won't force that issue, because I know there's a lot of, you know, people that might rely on it and all those things, but I do think it should be phased out very quickly if we are to implement the fixed route shuttle. And then, you know, really be willing to discontinue the fixed route shuttle if we just don't get the ridership that we're hoping to get. Because, you know, as we all know, once you implement a government program, no matter how successful it is, it's very, very difficult to get rid of it, period. And we know that, we've seen it. And so I think we have to be willing to say, you know what, this has not worked. This has not worked the way that we wanted it to. And so we need to rethink it. So those are the things that those are my thoughts on it. And what I thought I would propose tonight is to hold off on a vote on this and see if at least, you know, I don't know if Steve would want to appoint a subcommittee that we could then maybe talk to Franny and the other selectmen and maybe sort of think through benchmarks that would be part of this program, and then vote on it, I guess, at our next meeting, which will be right before town meeting, right? Mm-hmm. So those are my thoughts.
Comments? Yes, Bob.
I don't want to repeat Margaret's comments about the costs, but my back of the envelope suggests that the users are paying about 4% of the costs, and that the town's taxpayers are paying about 93% of the costs compared to the contributions of those who are riding. And I gave credit to Fixed Route for the same $4,600 that all the others seem to earn. I think it's very misleading to have the town under rail shuttle of $138, because $96,862 from the parking lot is 3 police cars, which we are buying out of the general funds every year. Those are town funds, and it's not somehow a magic tooth fairy that's in there. The other thing is, one of the previous times when transportation came up, I asked Doug, how much of a subsidy are other towns that are providing transportation services outside the regular MBTA services? What are they providing? And he said he was sure it could be found out, and I don't doubt what it could be found out, but it certainly hasn't been yet. And I don't expect to see it before town meeting, but I think this will be approved at town meeting. Next September, we will start this whole process over again, and it seems to me then is the time when you need to be able to discuss these things going forward. But I do have a question. The rail shuttle has this intense subsidy. Imagine Mr. X lives in West Acton, walks to the fire station, rides to the train station, goes home. He's going to pay over the course of a year whatever amount that's going to turn out to be. Mr. Y lives someplace else and drives and parks in our lovely parking lot and pays. What's the difference in how much those two gentlemen, or ladies if you want to make them ladies, pay relative to each other? It seems to me that I realize the parking lot operates very cheaply because there's nobody standing at the gate collecting the money, although presumably there are certain costs incurred at Town Hall which don't appear at all here. We have lots of those things, so I don't say that they necessarily should. But the Parkers are subsidizing the town extensively. The town is subsidizing the rail shuttle riders, on the other hand, and it would be nice to know how those stand out. And again, I realize 2 weeks before town meeting, Brian, are rather intense, and this is another question that can wait to be answered, but I really wish it would be answered someday.
Other comments? Brian, you happen to have those numbers on the top of your head?
Unfortunately, I do not.
Yes, Marianne.
Sorry, I have another question. I'm looking at the 5-year plan for transportation services that was in the budget book, and I'm trying to understand what's different between here and what's being proposed. So I understand that the 5-year plan does not include the fixed route shuttle, because that was envisioned separately at the time. But that's marked as 130,000. So if I add 130,000 to the town contribution, then I get 294. So is that 60,000 difference in the LRTA? Is that what's new?
Yeah, I don't have that in front of me, but.
Yes.
Okay. And my second question, which is for Brian, is do we have a new 5-year plan that includes the fixed route?
We can get you that new updated plan. I'll make sure we get that.
Because again, to Margaret's point, I think it would be important to see whether the plan is that we continue with all of these, or do we drop something? And that's what I'd kind of like to see how that fits.
You want to see the fixed route shuttle
Included in,
so you want to see it complete.
if you give me these, I'm going to look at them and ask you questions about them. This is great you give them to me, but thank you.
Other questions? Yes, Doug.
I guess I would underscore some comments I've made in the past. I'm supportive of these programs, and in my experience with them is that it takes quite a long time for the program to mature. You really end up having to try it in various venues at different times of day, appealing to different riderships. And as you do, you learn a lot about what your true ridership is in town. And in some areas, it doesn't pan out, and you drop the program for that area and you enhance it somewhere else. Ultimately, we'd like to get to the point where we have a clear picture where all of our routing has been tested. We know what the effects are on our parking lot for the train station. We know, what kind of feedback, and some of this we would have to actively seek feedback, but we know by that time how the shoe fits and how it doesn't. I think at that time it's really quite appropriate to make a decision about whether or not we want to continue the program. But it takes, my emphasis is that it takes a long time to develop the data. And I would underscore one other thing, which is that a public transportation, I don't know of any place in the country where there's a meaningful public transportation program which is self-sufficient. Maybe at Disneyland or something, but it's in terms of municipal systems like this one, they all lose, quote unquote, a substantial amount of money. What we're doing is we're buying a service that a significant number of people in town need and use. And we're providing that service along with a variety of other services that we provide. And I think our ridership is fairly deep at this point, and we'll get deeper with time. On that last point, I would emphasize that it's very important to have a marketing program that's been thoroughly thought out and is being operated perhaps by our local people, but designed by professionals and evaluated by professionals so that we're making sure that we reach all the potential riders. I'm not sure that this program has been as well publicized as perhaps it might. I'm just not positive that we've gotten out there and gotten in front of all the potential customers and said, hey, here's a terrific value, you should take advantage of it. I'd feel much more comfortable if I knew that that marketing program had been in place for a couple of years and we've been flogging the horse as hard as we could. I think that we've got some time yet to go. Developing benchmarks as we go along is useful, although I wouldn't pull a benchmark out at this point and say next year we got to shut this down unless the ridership is 0 or something really bad. I mean, in which case you don't need a benchmark. You can look at it on a common sense basis. You know, that segment of the program isn't working. But developing formal benchmarks, developing a formal marketing plan, and evaluating it on a continuous basis are themes that really should be upfront, so that we're not running buses around in the streets without anybody really understanding what we're doing. Thank you.
Bill?
Yeah, I would like to reinforce Margaret's comments and say that I endorse them. I just was sitting here remembering that it was 4 years ago when at town meeting this came up, and it was 232 to 1, and I was the one who voted against this. Not because I don't like transportation, but for exactly the reasons that we're talking about now 4 years later, which was there was no plan, there were no benchmarks, there is no way of defining success, and there's no way of defining failure. You remember that in those days we were getting subsidized by the state to start the program, and they were declining, and I met with the Transportation Committee and separately and reinforce this. So I won't go on further, but just to say, I think we need to have what is success and what is failure. And, you can certainly take the hypothetical or hyperbole, perhaps is a better word, and say, is $100 per ride too much, or $200 per ride, or $300 per ride too much? What is the right number? So I think most of us feel that that has to be established, and it wasn't. The goal is laudable. Doug articulated that very well just now, but those benchmarks that weren't established over the last 4 years, I think they need to be. And so if there's somebody here, especially if you're willing to take it on, Margaret, I really encourage you to do so, and to define success and define financial failure. So, thanks.
Other comments? Don't fight over the microphone, guys. Herman?
The fact of the matter is I find myself in agreement also with Margaret. And I remember that vote 4 years ago, and I was one of the 200 and some odd that said, yeah, public transportation is a laudable thing to pursue, and there's going to be a cost. But I agree with Bill and Margaret that we need to, once and for all, define exactly what is success, what is failure, and we should have benchmarks, particularly since we're adding another kind of service that now is in the mix. Instead of having 4, we now have 5 services. None of them seem to go away. We just keep adding to them. And the costs keep rising, therefore. And the cost per ride, when you do the back of the envelope, it was actually very surprising to me. $25, $35 a ride. My goodness. You could hire a cab for less than that, I imagine. You can go in almost anywhere in this town within the town for less than $25 a ride.
Yes, Mike.
Yeah, not to beat a dead horse, but I agree with Margaret. I think there's definitely some issues here that there is a need for benchmarks. I think a new program like this, since it is moving into uncharted territory in that they don't have a big statistical model that would that success would jump out at you saying, "Oh, there's an obvious need," where there's a required need. And I do think that like the dollar ride could easily cannibalize the fixed route shuttle, if not monitored carefully. So I think that in order, I think we could probably justify one or the other, but not both. And the new fixed route shuttle, as Doug said, you need to build some statistics on that. And so I think it needs to be, that program needs to be reviewed after, say, 2 years or annually but especially after the end of 2 or 3 years, you see what makes sense. I think the routes need to be adjusted, the locations adjusted, maybe the hours operation adjusted, cost adjusted, and unless these benchmarks are really put into the program, as Margaret says, you know, they live on forever, and even though they stop making any kind of rational economic sense.
Frank, please. Sure, Bill.
Just a quick question. On this slide here, the one that dial-a-ride with the blue and the orange graphs, what is canceled?
Brian, you get that one?
Yeah, those are, with the dial-a-ride, you need to call up and make an appointment beforehand, and those cancellations are those folks that called did not need that appointment any longer. If you look at the month of July.
The cancels are greater than the delivers.
There's a significant decrease in August. We presume those were school kids, and what happens typically, the dial-a-ride, they have scheduled pickups and drop-offs, and because school was out, obviously in July, you saw a dramatic decline because those rides weren't no longer needed because school was out.
Okay, all right, thank you.
Go ahead, Frank.
Hi, Franny Osmond, 16 Half Moon Hill, and on the Board of Selectmen. And I agree with a lot of what I'm hearing, but I just wanted to answer a couple of questions. First of all, we have been looking at benchmarks for the last 10 years, and we keep looking at them. And when I ask about how the dial-a-ride is working, I'm always asking, how many people are we taking? And I'm always frustrated, as everybody is, you know, there's only 1 or 2 people at a time. We started the dial-a-ride to just make it equitable. Originally, we had wanted a fixed route from all over town to the rail station, but we also wanted to be able to help. First of all, we couldn't afford and couldn't make it practical going across town. We were always told, and we're still told by Transaction, the company that runs it, is that it's easiest to make people get to the train on time if it's a very short distance, and it's more suitable to them. They're happier with it if it's not this long route. And so we thought, if we have a rail shuttle from just one part of town, well, how can we help the people on the other side of town? So we added the dial-a-ride. It was also an effort to help people who don't drive or can't afford to fix their car, or for whatever reason they can't drive, but they aren't eligible for the senior van. And the eligibility for the 2 senior vans has gone in and out. So one thing I've continued to agree with is the fact that it's crazy that we've had the Council on Aging van and the Roadrunner, and they all, for years, have had their people devoted to them, that they love the driver, they love the dispatcher. You know, they get used to it. And people really, it's hard for people to change. So those 2 programs were ongoing, and we were always told, and we were always trying to get them under one dispatch, and we have. And that's allowed us to move to many more hours a day dispatch, which in turn caused more cancellations, which was actually a good thing because it's allowed for same-day requests for rides. So there have been things that have been able to improve. The dial-a-ride helps people who aren't eligible for those other vans, and the fixed route should take care of some of those people, but not all of them. And so I would hesitate to take the dial-a-ride away, because you're going to leave some people who, for reasons of equity, we created the dial-a-ride so people on the other side of town from the train station would have some way of getting around, and it's proven to be very useful for people who don't ride. Like Lexington, people who take the public transportation tend to be either youth or seniors in general. But in town, if you take the van, oftentimes it's someone with a developmental disability going to a job on another side of town, or it's someone who's a student whose parent is working, and they need to get home after going to extra school help or a club or a sport. For the expenditures, there was talk about the amount of money per trip. One of those things I've always measured it by is that the ride, the MBTA's dial-a-ride, so to speak, is on average $75 a trip. That was from about 2 years ago. I don't know what it is today. And true, they take a lot of long trips. But it's generally agreed in the business that below $25 is a good goal. And it's true. If we had a good taxi service, it would be great if we could just say, let's just pay for taxi rides. So I am as frustrated as everybody at the small number of people that can practically take the dial-a-ride. And I wouldn't mind seeing it decrease as long as we were helping the people who can't take the fixed route and aren't eligible for the Council on Aging van or Roadrunner for whatever reason. I don't see people taking the dial-a-ride if they can take the fixed route, because most people would rather not have to call ahead and arrange a specific time. They'd rather know exactly when it's coming. Time and again, I tell people, did you know we have public transportation in town? And they say, where's the stop? That's what I always hear. Oh, well, tell me, where's the stop? And so this is a great change that we're finally putting in fixed route. But I would hesitate to totally take away dial-a-ride until we see how many of those people are helped, because there still will be a subset of people who have grown to depend on the dial-a-ride. And if we can cover them with the Council on Aging van and Roadrunner, we will. They can legally go on, anybody can legally go on those rides, but priority it has to be given to the eligible populations. It gets a little confusing when it's an hour before, if somebody calls who isn't one of those eligible populations, and somebody says, the dispatcher says, yes, we happen to have a van, we can take you. If half an hour later somebody calls and says, I'm a senior and I need a ride, it's a little unclear what happens. But I think the dispatchers have rules and guidelines that help them deal with that. But in answer to those ways of measuring, I have always been asking the questions, and for every grant application that we have to write, we've been asking the questions that you're talking about. So I'm all on board on continuing to make those measurements and on looking at how the fixed route can cover that. I'm just seeing if there was another. Oh, you had asked about the cost to the rider if they walk versus if they drive, and I just sent to FinCom. Do you have 2 M's or 1 M in your email address?
Just one.
Okay, I just sent you the, the schedule that shows the relative cost. And the LRTA, I wouldn't describe it really as grants, because in addition, there are grants. Sometimes there's state and federal grants. There are the Federal Transit Authority, FTA grants that we use sometimes. The LRTA is the money that either goes, we have to pay it to the MBTA, or we can put it through our Regional Transit Authority. So either way, we're going to be paying it to some transit authority. The question is whether it goes to MBTA or to the Lowell Regional Transit Authority. I think that was all I could answer. If you add up all the trips, it came to about $22 a trip. And I personally would love to see it less, but that's pretty good so far. But I am also frustrated. One last revenue idea that I've heard the schools, people who work in the schools say, and also I think, is selling passes to parents for the fixed route and for the dial-a-ride, so that they wouldn't have to keep paying fares, and you could get a lot of families who would probably pay, even if they didn't think they would use it all the time. It would be easy to tell your kid, you have this pass, you don't have to ask me for fare money. So,
Franny, is it feasible, and then less than 2 weeks before town meeting, that the Board of Selectmen could talk to a subcommittee of FinCom about metrics and a decision?
I'd be happy to sit down.
My sense of the
and-
committee is they'd rather not vote tonight, if I'm getting that correctly, if there's more information that can be had in the next 2 weeks.
Well, the only information that I heard asked about was what other towns are subsidizing. I know that Lexington always votes an override. One year they didn't, and people ended up being very upset to pay for their transportation. But interestingly, they have gone from having a fixed route for years to adding dial-a-ride. And here we are going the opposite. So one thing I really want to do is sit down with them and compare notes.
Okay.
But I'd be happy to hash out and also look at data that we've collected over the years. I think Crosstown Connect is a really good source of the data since they dispatch for us and dispatch many different services.
Doug, you have a question?
I would suggest that there's probably not time to do, a satisfactory amount of digging and modeling and so on, but before town meeting, this is a work in progress, the whole thing. However, I think that the message from the committee that I'm hearing loud and clear is that we need to do some modeling of performance statistics. What is considered appropriate in terms of levels of ridership and so on, and how to compare our costs to private sector alternatives like taxi cabs and so on. For example, I'm looking at the slide that's the dial-a-ride slide, and if you just go through and look at the delivered numbers here, I assume that the first month, January, for example, is about 250 people rode it in January. And then going through and adding up the dots, I come up with a little under 4,000 riders for the year 2014, right? If I then go back and I look at this chart, which is the program overall, and look at the dial-a-ride, the cost of the dial-a-ride, which is not subsidized by outside agencies like LRTA. So this is a real good example of what we're paying and what we're getting and so on. That's about $95,000. And dividing that roughly, by 4,000, rounding up the 3,900 actual ridership for 14, indicates that the cost per ride is somewhere around 22 or 24, I've lost my place, $24, which as I understand it is a pretty good number. But it would be appropriate to take that sort of comparison and apply that test of viability or test of profitability or loss and so on to each of these programs so that you can see, okay, here's what it cost us, but what did we get out of it? Well, the answer is you got 4,000 people who got a ride, okay? And then that cost per capita ended up being about $24. That gives us something we can sink our teeth into, and so I think that sort of modeling would be useful to do so that when we come up on this thing next year, we're loaded. We've got everything we need to understand what the strong and weak parts of this thing are. It gives you the ability to say, program X, which is testing out at, say, $24, is a new program and won't hit its speed for 2 more years. We've done no marketing on it. There's been no effort to get ridership built up. We're not there yet. It's still in the launch phase. And you will consider an appropriate number for that one to be $16 3 years out. That gives us something grounded in what's happening now and a basis for thinking about how some of these things can be moved ahead. The converse of all that, of course, is that if there's a program that has matured, that we have been working on, and the cost per ride is $35, and I'm just pulling these numbers at this point, then you may decide that's a program that needs to get phased or merged in with something else. But you have a basis for making those judgments at that point. And I think it'd be really useful to do that. Mm-hmm. But in any case, I emphasize once again, these things are a work in progress. It's possible to put too short a leash on it. And while I'm in favor of the benchmarks, as I've just described, I think that we have to be patient.
Mm-hmm. I totally agree. And I also agree, whoever said we really need to market. Definitely we should have those benchmarks written out so you can compare them year to year. And we do have them, but as you said, it would be nice if you could see the dollars per ride for each service and compare. The marketing, new service, as you said, takes a while to show, and I remember one of the first documents I read was put out by the Metropolitan Area Planning Council, and it said New services work the best when they're well-marketed, they're reliable, and they're frequent. And we don't quite have the frequency with the van coming every hour for the fixed route, so that's the kind of thing that would limit it.
Okay. Mr. Chairman?
Yes, Doug.
Let me just follow on. I mean, the thing I guess why we emphasize this, when we talk about marketing on this committee, is because this program first appeared before us, I think, 4 years ago. And at that time, the first 3 years were subsidized on a declining basis. And the theory was that after 3 years of these heavy subsidies from third parties other than us, the transportation program would achieve some level of viability, however you calculate that, okay? And so the losses that were apparent, you know, when you pull those subsidies out, you could say, wow, you know, but when the subsidies were in there, it was tolerable. And we were saying loud and clear at the time that the program must be heavily marketed in order to be successful, because when the subsidy goes away, we don't want to be left holding the bag. And that was the sense of where this committee was coming from at the time. The subsidies have expired, and the losses are substantial. Subsidies, or however you want to describe that, are substantial. So I think that just goes back to our emphasis on the need, the imperative of marketing these things as hard as we can, that they're not going to drift up on their own.
I totally agree. I actually agree with, I mean, I don't agree with the viability. I agree that you've been saying it should be viable by the end of this, and I think I've been saying it's never viable. It's not, public transportation just doesn't work, just like the roads don't pay us back for the roads unless we charge tolls that completely pay for them. Things just cost.
And what we're saying is not profitability. Nobody here is saying profitability. What Bill's been saying and Margaret has been saying is that viability is determined based on benchmarks that you build in and come back and sell everybody with. Okay? And if it doesn't meet those benchmarks, it isn't viable by definition.
Yeah. So
all right,
I'm happy to sit down with you.
Margaret. And Doug to be a subcommittee to meet over the next 2 weeks to try and get some more benchmarks and more information on this, and we'll take it up for a vote at our pre-town meeting. Thank you.
Can I make one comment just to close this
Sure.
out? So, actually, two comments. One is just, I just wanted to acknowledge that in this deck is, there are statistics of sort of where the Dial-A-Ride, Roadrunner, and COA van are, and that's partly how they determine the fixed route location, because, you know, to Franny's and Doug's point earlier, you know, part of it is you test it out, and I think the Dial-A-Ride and these other services have been helpful to test out, right, where people are going and where they want to go. So I wanted to point that out. Then I also wanted to say that while, and I'm happy to do the committee, and that was what I was hoping for tonight, to work with Franny and some of the other people to nail this down. But I don't think we have to, I know 2 weeks is a short amount of time, but I don't think we have to just rely on trying to research out all these different comps, because that'll take a lot of time. But I do think we can just say, what is our tolerance level as a town, regardless of what other towns are doing, regardless of what, you know, is good for Boston or Lexington or whatever, what is our tolerance level for what we want to subsidize this? And how long do we want to go? So I'm just saying that I don't think there has to be a tremendous amount of research just to get to that.
Okay.
So, thank you.
All right, moving on to the ambulance oh, Mary Ann.
Can I just ask one more question? I'm not sure whether Margaret or Brian has the answer. Back to this LRTA amount, the 160,000, do we get that regardless, or do we only get 60,000 of it if we do a fixed route?
The fixed route would give us the additional 60,000 right now, so you only get the LRTA money if you had a new program.
Okay, thank you.
Bob, you want to walk us through the ambulance enterprise fund and whatever you've been talking to the chief and Steve Barrett and Brian about?
With regard to the ambulance fund, I had several concerns. One is the fact that if you look at the estimated fund balance at the end of this fiscal year in the warrant, and you look at the estimated fund balance from their budget, they are several $100,000 apart. Reality would suggest that the budget number should be in there. However, a long discussion with both Brian and Steve, it turns out that DOR regulations have the interesting idea that because we allocated money for ALS for this year, which was not spent for reasons which were never quite clear, but are associated with union negotiations, and we propose to spend that money again next year, it's as if it's already been spent, and therefore you can't count it. It's a kind of accounting that bewilders me, and I wonder what textbook shows this. But anyway, DOR requires the numbers that are in there, so that's the end of that. My other concern was with the level of the subsidy from the general taxpayers, which went up from last year's $123,000 to this year's $162,000. It's unnecessary because what is happening is that the reserves of the ambulance fund exceed those that are necessary to actually run the ambulance fund. And we have, in the last few years, been trying to get rid of all these small amounts of reserves hiding hither, thither, and yon. We had an interesting discussion about it. Clearly, this is something to raise again with next year's budget because it's too late in some sense, to do it for this year. We didn't discuss, but the rate at which equipment is replaced in the fire department, because it has this ambulance fund, is, I suspect, greater than the rate at which equipment is replaced in the general budget. How 5-year replacements for ambulances and command cars would do if it went through what they lovingly refer to as the days on the hill, I don't know. But it is typical, I think, when you have segregated funds that you can spend them more easily than if you have to reach into the cookie jar with everybody else. So that's another reason why you should not have large amounts of funds in there. But those were the two things. We had a good discussion. I think we need to come back, especially, at least my perception is, the Finance Committee should come back next year early on and have a discussion about what level of reserves is appropriate for that particular enterprise fund. But I will, at this time, Mr. Chairman, move that we recommend the ambulance fund at town meeting.
Okay, is there a second? Discussion. All right, all in favor of recommending, is it still Article 17? Ambulance enterprise budget, say aye. Aye. Opposed? Abstentions? Okay, motion carries. Brian, if you'll bear with me, is there a budget transfer this year? All right, then we'll move over that one. Are the collective bargaining agreements going to happen? Or, okay. No. I believe we need to
Which articles were those, Doug? Do you know? Those bargaining ones?
10, 11, and 12 were the last article index. Herman, they changed the number on capital, so I think we need to revote Article 9. I think last time we voted, it was $60,000 more than the number that we have now. 70. So if you would just make a motion to Article 9, capital infrastructure.
I recommend that we recommend Article 9 at the amount of $88,300.
Second.
All in favor? Aye. Opposed? Abstentions?
So they got rid of the street light?
Yeah.
Yes. They're not, they're not getting rid of it, but they're funding it for others.
One of these other mystery. Sorry. It's just another place.
Okay. Bill, is there, on 25 and 26, the repurposing, we didn't recommend those. Do you want to make a motion?
Yeah, I recommend 25 and 26.
Is there a second?
Second.
Is there anything else we need to know about them?
They're repurposing the articles that total, the amount, we didn't have the amounts, they're in the warrant now. I don't have it in front of me. But it's in aggregate, it allows the transfer of the land and to buy the Harris Street property basically for $0 or thereabouts, close to it.
Brian, do you actually have the amounts?
Okay, I recommend Article 25, which is to repurpose Article 27 under 1998 in the amount of $100,000.
Second? Second. Any discussion? You want to add something, Brian?
No, the original article was $100,000. There has been some money's expended. It looks like in Article 24.
That's the first, I did that one first. Then.
$94,656.
94,656?
Yes.
Okay.
Even though it says 100,000.
No, okay, there's two articles. What Brian is referring to is Article 24, so if that's okay, I'll recommend Article 24 in that amount.
Wait, Article,
Article 24 is the amount that he just mentioned. Article 25 is 91,000.
Oh, I thought the two articles were 25, 26, no, 24, 25?
Article 24 is, should we start again? I recommend Article 24, which is to amend the previous authorization for cemetery facilities. It was previously $100,000, and now there's $94,656 remaining.
Wait, is this because we changed the order again?
Maybe.
Maybe. The old one from last time, Article 24 was the CPC.
Right, CPC.
This is the posted
The
one.
newest one?
Okay. All right, it's been moved and seconded to recommend Article 24. Any discussion? All in favor, say aye.
Aye.
Opposed? Abstentions?
Mr. Chairman, I recommend Article 25, which is the second of these two articles. Similarly, $100,000, of which there's $91,848 remaining.
Is there a second?
Second.
Any discussion? Seeing none, all in favor of recommending Article 25, say aye. Opposed? Abstentions? Okay, article carries. Do we have any more articles to recommend? I don't think we do. Yes, Chairman.
Just for the record, the two land acquisitions have been pulled.
Okay, that's what I thought, but
They just, I guess recently, like day before yesterday, got the appraisals. Well, on mine, 30 and 31, I believe. No, I'm sorry, 28,
28,
29.
29, the old article.
Yeah,
listed.
I don't know what the posted one is.
Oh, I see. The 28 and 29 are gone.
The old 28.
Yeah, they're being pulled,
FKA, formerly known
both of them.
How best should I record this in the minutes from like the last week and stuff? Because they're going to be different article numbers. I mean, I tended to label what they were, but.
Just leave them as labeled as what they are. Article numbers tend to change. All right, moving on, we did not deal with the minutes of March 3rd last time, so take a motion to approve the minutes from. Second?
Second.
All in favor?
Aye.
Opposed? Abstentions? You were not there, so it would be
Well, you were
good.
on there last week, or last on the 10th.
Yeah, that's true.
Third?
You were there on the 3rd.
I'll tell you if you were there.
That was the meeting at the public safety facility, you were there.
Physically, you were there.
Exactly. And I'm sorry, I did not get minutes for last time because I just got too crazy.
It's all right.
I will have them next time.
We'll have something more to do in our pre-town.
What'd you say?
Let the clerk record that Margaret's life is too crazy to do. All right, then we will meet as we normally do at 6 p.m. On Monday. I'll post whatever nights of town meeting for 6. I doubt that we'll need to meet the second night, but who knows? Something could come up that we'll have to deal with. So as of now, yes, Mary Ann?
Did you say, or is there anything happening on the collective bargaining agreements, or those are going to be passed over as
well,
best as you know right now?
As far as I know, they'll be passed over, but something could happen between,
Okay.
you know.
I'm
which-
sorry, I didn't know if I missed that.
Those and then the transportation one.
All right. If anybody who's commenting on articles, which should be everybody if they come up, consult your minutes to see whether it was a split vote or not. If it's a split vote, please try and convey to some degree both sides of the comments. If you're in doubt, write up your comments and send them to me.
And I'll send out the minutes from March 10th as soon as I can. I mean, they're almost done, but I just didn't have time to go through and, edit them. So, but I'll send them out sooner rather than later so that you guys can see that.
Okay, do we have any committee reports? Yes, Roland.
CPC met last week and they're putting together, going over their PowerPoint for our town meeting. They're very happy with the vote that we took to recommend their article.
Okay. Other, yes, Bob.
The Health Insurance Trust didn't meet, but the expenditure level for the most recent month was somewhat lower than it was for the previous couple of months, so things look like they'll move in the direction in which we had anticipated when we set the rates.
Okay. Anybody else? Yes, Mary Ann.
I just wanted to share that the Morrison Farm Committee, which has not been meeting for a year now, met
Oh,
last week.
congratulations.
Yep, we met last week, and we are working on plans that 2 parts of the 3 pieces that were funded at last year's annual town meeting will be getting underway as soon as we can see ground. So we'll be working on the parking improvements at Ice House Pond and also the historical survey of the Ice House Foundation and the Robbins Foundation, and hope to get those both underway early this spring.
All right, yes, Mike.
Just the Minuteman Building Committee, they have started their process, their cycle of visiting all 16 member communities to do their presentation and to get purpose of getting to bring the communities up to date and to get feedback on which one of the selective strategies is best for them.
Okay. Anybody else? Herman.
Selectmen met last night. The town manager's contract has now been extended, so he's working now on the revolving 3-year contract. It's now 3 years again. And they also approved his salary, but it did it in executive session, so I'm not sure I know what the number is. I know I don't know what the number is. The rest of their meeting was in discussion of town meeting and their positions on warrant articles. There was a lively discussion about pay-as-you-throw, and it was, they were violently agreeing, trying to figure out how best to posture the argument. And I'll be honest, I left my notes at home. I can't remember. The other one was transportation, where they had a discussion on like we just did, or similar. It was a very short meeting.
Well, hopefully this one is too. And before we adjourn, and before Bill runs out the door, let me recognize the fact that both Bill and Mary Ann will be stepping off the committee at the end of our year, which we're not sure when it ends. We believe it's May.
Just tell me when not to come.
For those of you who were on the committee before them, which I think is only Bob and me at this point, Herman was in and out, I have to say that it's a far, far better committee now than it was then, and due not in small part to the contributions that Bill and Mary Ann have made. There was no point of view before Bill Mullen. I don't mean we didn't have a point of view document. I mean we didn't have a point of view. We had 9 people all over the place. There was no long-range plan before Mary Ann put it together. Those are 2 of the keystones of the work we do every single year, and those are the people that made those happen. And we're losing a tremendous amount of experience, not only as a committee, but, you know, again, for those people not having been around as long as some of others, this was not their first rodeo. Bill was a selectman, Mary Ann was on the school committee, and hopefully they'll still be involved in the town in some respects, but personally I will miss them both. I know we all will. Mr. Borden.
Motion to adjourn.
All in favor?
I just sent out an email every